Your dreams are worthless. My mother said it like she was reading a receipt, flat, final, already decided, and I remember noticing the way her hand stayed on the door handle like she needed something solid to hold on to while she erased me from the house I grew up in, and I stood there with one suitcase, not even full, just enough to make it look like I had somewhere to go, and I nodded because I always nodded, because arguing with my mother was like arguing with gravity, technically possible, practically useless, and I said, I understand, Mom, because I did understand. I understood that in her world numbers mattered more than dreams, paychecks more than ideas, and certainty more than anything that didn't come with a monthly statement, and she exhaled like I had made it easier for her, like my compliance was a kindness I offered, and maybe it was, because I could see it in her eyes, not anger, not even disappointment, just calculation, like she had already run the numbers on my life and decided I was a bad investment, and behind her, my father stood in the hallway, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just present in the way furniture is present, and I smiled a little because smiling has always been my way of making difficult moments feel smaller, and I said, I'll try to make it worth something, Mom, and she didn't respond, not because she didn't hear me, but because in her mind the conversation was already over, and she opened the door wider, not aggressively, just enough to let cold air in, and I stepped out with my suitcase, the wheels catching on the edge of the porch for a second before settling into place, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small could feel like resistance, like the house itself hesitated to let me go even if the people inside didn't, and I walked down the steps slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I have always believed that if you move slowly enough, you notice things other people miss, the way the porch light flickered twice before going steady, the way the neighbor's dog barked once and then stopped, the way my mother didn't call my name, not even once, and when I reached the sidewalk, I turned back, not for closure, just out of habit, and the door was already closed, not slammed, just closed, clean, efficient, like the end of a sentence that didn't need a period, and I stood there for a moment, breathing in air that felt colder than it should have, and I said quietly, mostly to myself, that's okay, because I have always preferred conversations that don't require the other person to stay, and I adjusted the handle of my suitcase, straightened my shoulders, and started walking. And somewhere between the first step and the second, something shifted, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet decision settling into place, because if my dreams were worthless, then I would simply have to become the kind of person who could afford to prove that wrong, and I did not run, I did not cry, I did not look back again, I just kept walking, one block, then another, carrying everything I had in a suitcase that was lighter than it should have been, and heavier than anything I had ever carried before. My name is Tige Monroe, and I have always been the kind of person who notices the small things, not because I try to, but because it feels impolite not to, like when someone pauses before they say your name or when a room goes quiet half a second too early, and that night, walking down a street I could have mapped with my eyes closed, I noticed everything, the uneven crack in the sidewalk near the mailbox, the flicker of a porch light 2 houses down, the faint smell of laundry detergent drifting from an open window, details that did not change even though my entire life just had, and I remember thinking that consistency was comforting, even when people were not, and I adjusted my grip on the suitcase and said softly, all right, Tige, let us not make this dramatic, because I have always believed that if you can keep your tone steady, your mind will eventually follow, and I walked for about 20 minutes before my phone buzzed in my hand, a message from my mother, just one line, make sure you take your documents, and I almost smiled, because even in the middle of cutting me off, she was still managing logistics, still making sure the paperwork made sense, and I typed back, already with me, Mom. Thank you, because manners are not situational, they are structural, and I was not going to lose mine just because I had lost an address, and I turned onto the main road where the street lights were brighter, more honest somehow, and I sat on a bench near a bus stop that had seen better days, the paint peeling, the schedule half torn, and I placed my suitcase beside me and exhaled slowly, not heavily, just enough to reset, and I opened my phone and looked at the notes app where I had been writing ideas for months, small sketches of a future that did not fit inside my mother's version of stability, and I scrolled through them, one by one, not to reassure myself, but to remind myself that I had already started building something, even if no one else could see it yet, and I said quietly, they are not worthless, they are just early, and that sentence stayed with me, simple, polite, and slightly defiant in a way that would not offend anyone but still meant everything, and I pulled my jacket tighter as a car passed, the headlights sweeping over me for a moment before moving on, and I realized that being unseen was not new to me, it was just more official now, and there is a difference between being overlooked and being removed, one is accidental, the other is intentional, and I decided right there on that bench that I would treat this like a long project, not a crisis, because crises demand panic and projects demand patience, and I have always been better at patience, and I stood up when the bus arrived, the doors opening with a tired hiss, and the driver glanced at me, then at the suitcase, then back at me, and I smiled and said, "Just one passenger tonight," and he nodded like that was enough explanation, and I stepped on, dropped a few bills into the box, and took a seat near the window, and as the bus pulled away, I watched the neighborhood slide past, house by house, light by light, until it all blended into something unrecognizable, and I leaned my head back and closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, just to organize, because when everything changes at once, the most respectful thing you can do for yourself is to take it one decision at a time, and my first decision was simple, I was not going to go back, not tomorrow, not next week, not when things felt easier, I would only return when I had something that did not need approval, something that could stand on its own without explanation, and I whispered, almost like a promise, give it time, because time, unlike people, has a very consistent track record of showing what things are actually worth. I did not go anywhere dramatic that night, no grand plan, no sudden breakthrough, just a small apartment I found 3 days later above a convenience store that never quite slept, the kind of place where the floor creaks in predictable patterns and the refrigerator hums like it is thinking out loud, and I liked it immediately because it did not pretend to be more than it was. And I paid $680 a month for a space that could barely fit a bed, a desk, and a chair that leaned slightly to the left, and I remember setting my suitcase down in the middle of the room and saying, well, this is efficient, because if you can describe your life with one word and still smile, you are probably going to be fine, and I started working the next morning, not in the way people imagine when they hear the word dream, no spotlight, no applause, just hours, quiet, consistent hours, a coffee shop in the mornings, a retail shift in the afternoons, and late nights at that small desk where I would open my laptop and build something that no one had asked for and no one was paying for yet, and every now and then my mother's voice would appear in my head, not loud, just precise, dreams do not pay bills, and I would nod slightly even though she was not there and say, not yet, because I have always believed that disagreement does not require disrespect, and I was not trying to prove her wrong. I was trying to outgrow the question entirely, and there were days when the numbers did not work, when rent felt heavier than it should and the grocery list became a negotiation with myself, and I would stand in the aisle holding two options and say quietly, we will take the one that lasts longer, because longevity is a kind of luxury people do not talk about enough. And I did not tell anyone how I was living, not because I was hiding, but because I was building, and those are not the same thing, and I kept everything simple, one notebook, one laptop, one growing list of ideas that I treated like small investments, not all of them would work, but enough of them might, and that was the math I trusted, and about 6 months in, I got my first real response, not money, not yet, just an email, 3 lines, we like your concept. Can you send more? And I read it twice, then a third time, not because it was complicated, but because it was the first time someone outside my own head had said yes to something I created, and I leaned back in that uneven chair and smiled, not wide, just enough to register the moment, and I said, all right, that is something, and I sent more, careful, measured, making sure every word I wrote carried its own weight, because if you are going to ask someone to believe in your work, the least you can do is respect their attention, and weeks passed, then months, small responses turning into small payments turning into something that looked almost like stability if you did not stare at it too long, and I kept going, because stopping would have required a level of certainty I did not have, and continuing only required a decision I had already made, and every time I thought about going back, just to make things easier, just to hear my name spoken in a familiar way, I would picture the door closing, not dramatically, just firmly, and I would remind myself, you said you would return with something that stands on its own, and I am very careful with promises, especially the ones I make when no one else is listening, and so I stayed, I worked, I learned how to turn quiet effort into visible results, one piece at a time, until the life I was building no longer needed to be explained to anyone who had already decided it was not worth understanding. By the end of the first year, I had learned something my mother never taught me and something no one ever says out loud: stability is not a place you arrive at, it is something you construct piece by piece, often in silence, and my silence had started to look like progress, not to anyone watching, but to me, and that was enough, and I moved out of that small apartment above the convenience store into another place 3 miles away, still modest, still practical, but the floors did not creak and the chair did not lean. And I remember standing in that empty living room with a key in my hand and saying, "This feels earned, not impressive. Not extraordinary, just earned," and I kept working the same way, careful, consistent, almost polite in how I handled my own ambition, never rushing it, never forcing it, just letting it grow in a direction that made sense. And the work changed too, small projects became larger ones, emails became calls. Calls became meetings where people started asking for my opinion instead of just my output, and I noticed that shift immediately because I notice shifts, that is what I do, and one afternoon, sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and I answered the way I always do, calm, measured, "This is Tige," and the voice on the other end said, "Ms. Monroe, we reviewed your work and we would like to bring you on for a longer contract," and I paused, just for a second. Not because I was surprised, but because I believe in giving moments the space they deserve, and I said, "I appreciate that, may I ask what made you decide?" And there was a brief silence, the kind that usually means the answer matters, and then he said, "You are consistent, and you see things others miss," and I smiled slightly because that was the first time someone had described me in a way that felt complete, not reduced, not simplified, just accurate, and I said, "Then I would be happy to continue." And when the call ended, I did not celebrate, not immediately. I wrote down the details, reviewed the terms, made sure everything aligned, because excitement is useful, but clarity is more reliable, and that contract became the first piece of something larger, something that started to carry its own weight, and over the next few years, that pattern repeated, one opportunity leading to another, not dramatically, just steadily, like a door that opens 1 inch at a time until you realize you are no longer outside. And I built a small team, not because I needed help, but because I respected scale, and scale requires structure, and I treated the people who worked with me the way I had wished to be treated, clear, fair, and attentive, and in return, they trusted me, not loudly, but consistently, and somewhere along the way, people stopped asking if this was temporary and started asking what I was planning next, and that question always made me smile because planning implies permanence, and permanence was something I had been denied once and rebuilt without asking for permission, and every now and then, usually late at night when the work was quiet and the city outside my window had settled into a soft hum, I would think about that sentence again, the one that had followed me from the front door to the bus stop to every desk I had ever worked at, and I would repeat it in my head, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet curiosity: dreams do not pay bills. And then I would look at the numbers on my screen, the contracts, the invoices, the steady flow of something that had once been invisible, and I would say, almost politely, "They seem to be learning," and I would close my laptop, turn off the light, and let the room settle into silence, knowing that I had not just built a career, I had built something that no longer needed to defend its existence to anyone, including the person who had once decided it had none. By the time 5 years had passed, I no longer measured progress in months or milestones. I measured it in conversations, in the way people spoke to me differently, the way they paused before responding, the way they listened a little longer than necessary, and those are things you cannot invoice, but they are often more valuable than anything that fits on a balance sheet, and I had built a rhythm that worked: mornings structured, afternoons flexible, evenings reserved for thinking, not reacting, because I had learned that reacting too quickly is how you repeat old patterns, and I had no interest in repeating anything that led me back to that front door. And one afternoon, during a meeting that had already gone 20 minutes longer than scheduled, someone across the table said, "We would like you to lead this," and I noticed the phrasing immediately: not help, not assist, lead, and I folded my hands calmly and said, "If I lead it, I will structure it differently," and he nodded. "That is why we asked," and I accepted, not with excitement, but with clarity, because leadership is not About being chosen, it is about being prepared when the question is asked, and that project became the kind of work people talk about in rooms I had never been invited into before, and invitations started arriving quietly, an email here, a call there, each one phrased with a little more respect than the last, and I handled them all the same way, polite, measured, never overcommitting, never underestimating, because balance is easier to maintain than to recover, and somewhere in the middle of all that, I moved again, this time not out of necessity, but out of preference, a place with larger windows, more light, and a desk that did not face a wall, and I remember standing there one morning with a cup of coffee, watching the city move below me, and saying, "This will do," because I have never needed excess, only alignment, and my name started appearing in places that once felt distant, contracts with numbers that would have made my earlier self pause longer, but now felt like a natural extension of the work, not a surprise, and I built systems to handle it all, not just for efficiency, but for peace, because chaos, even successful chaos, is still chaos, and I prefer quiet control. And then one evening, as I was reviewing a set of documents at my desk, my phone lit up with a number I recognized immediately, not because it had appeared often, but because it had not appeared at all in years, and I let it ring once, then twice, not to create tension, but to give myself a moment to decide how I would answer, and when I picked up, I kept my voice steady, the same tone I used in every conversation that mattered, "Hello," and there was a pause on the other end, longer than expected, the kind of silence that carries weight, and then my mother's voice, softer than I remembered, less certain, "Tige," and I closed my eyes briefly, not out of emotion, but out of recognition, because some moments do not need reaction, they need acknowledgement, and I said, "Hello, Mom," the word landing carefully, exactly where it belonged, and she exhaled like she had been holding that breath for a while, and for a few seconds, neither of us spoke, not because we had nothing to say, but because we both understood that whatever came next would not be casual, and she finally continued, "I hope I am not interrupting," and I glanced at the documents in front of me, the contracts, the schedules, the life I had built without her approval, and I said, "I can make time," because I could, and because making time is not the same as giving it away, and there was another pause, shorter this time, more fragile, and then she said, "I need to talk to you about something important," and I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city lights beginning to settle into the evening, and I replied, "Of course, Mom, what do you need?" And as the silence that followed stretched just a little too long, I realized this was not a conversation about catching up, this was something else entirely, something that had crossed a line my mother rarely approached, and I sat there, calm, attentive, waiting, the same way I had learned to wait years ago, knowing that when people finally reach out after a long silence, it is almost never without a reason. She did not say it right away, not the real reason, she moved around it first, like people do when the truth feels too sharp to hold directly, and I listened without interrupting because I have learned that silence is not just absence, it is a tool, and she said, "Your father has been dealing with something," and I noticed the phrasing immediately, not we, not us, your father, and I asked gently, "Is he all right, Mom?" keeping my tone steady, respectful, the same way I would speak in any conversation that mattered, and she paused again, then said, "He is fine, it is not his health," and I nodded even though she could not see me, because clarification matters, and she continued, "There have been some financial complications," and I let the words settle, not reacting, just placing them where they belonged, because words like that are rarely accidental, and I asked, "What kind of complications?" And there was a shift in her voice, something quieter, less structured, "We trusted someone we should not have," and I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking at the city lights reflecting against the window, and I said, "That happens more often than people admit, not as comfort, just as fact," and she exhaled, almost relieved that I did not challenge her, and then she said it, not directly, but close enough, "We might lose the house," and I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because some patterns do not change, they just evolve, and I asked one more question, the one that mattered, "What do you need from me, Mom?" And there it was again, that pause, longer this time, heavier. Because asking is different from explaining, and she finally said, "I was hoping you could look at some documents, maybe give us some advice," and I almost smiled, not visibly, just internally, because advice is a careful word, it leaves room for pride, it avoids the weight of asking for help, and I said, of course, I can review them, and I meant it, not out of obligation, but because I have never believed that understanding should be withheld just because it was once denied, and she added quickly, we would not ask if it was not important, and I responded, I understand, because I understood that reaching out after years of silence is rarely comfortable, and I respected that effort even if it came late, and she hesitated once more before saying, there is a meeting tomorrow with some people involved, and we thought it might help if you were there, and I let that settle for a moment, not rushing to answer, because presence is different from participation, and I said, I can attend, and there was a subtle shift on the other end, something like relief, something like uncertainty, both existing at the same time, and she said quietly, thank you, Tige, and I noticed the way she said my name, not clipped, not distant, just careful, like she was relearning how to use it, and I replied, you are welcome, Mom, keeping everything exactly where it belonged, and after we ended the call, I did not move right away, I stayed in my chair, looking at the reflection of the room behind me, the desk, the files, the structure I had built piece by piece, and I thought about the difference between then and now, not in terms of success, but in terms of position, because once I had stood outside a door waiting to be let in, and now I was being asked to walk into a room that needed something only I could provide, and I said quietly, almost as a reminder, we will handle this properly, not as a promise to them, but as a standard for myself, and I reached for my laptop, already organizing the next steps, because whatever this situation was, it was no longer just theirs, it had entered my field now, and I intended to treat it with the same clarity, patience, and quiet precision that had built everything else in my life. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was nervous, but because I respect rooms before I enter them, and the building itself said everything I needed to know before anyone spoke, polished floors, quiet reception, the kind of place where decisions are made in low voices and recorded in very precise language, and I paused for a moment outside the glass doors, adjusting the sleeve of my jacket, not for appearance, but for alignment, because details matter more when the stakes are high, and when I stepped inside, I noticed her immediately, my mother, sitting a little straighter than usual, hands folded in her lap, not checking her phone, not scanning the room, just waiting, and that told me more than anything she could have said, and when she saw me, she stood up, not quickly, just enough to acknowledge my presence, and for a second, we simply looked at each other, measuring the years that had passed without needing to name them, and I smiled slightly and said, good morning, Mom. Keeping my tone even, respectful, exactly where it belonged, and she nodded, good morning, Tige, and her voice carried something new, not just tension, but awareness, like she understood this meeting was not the same as any conversation we had before, and my father stood beside her, quieter than I remembered, not withdrawn, just diminished in a way that comes from dealing with problems you cannot control, and he said, thank you for coming, and I inclined my head slightly, of course, because gratitude, when it is real, deserves to be received without comment, and we were led into a conference room where 2 men and a woman were already seated, folders open, pens aligned, everything arranged to suggest order, even if the situation itself was not, and I took a seat across from them, placing my bag beside the chair, not opening it yet, because I prefer to observe before I engage, and one of the men began, Ms. Monroe, we appreciate you joining us, and I nodded, I am here to understand the situation, and he slid a set of documents across the table, explaining terms, obligations, timelines, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, letting the structure reveal itself, because problems, like people, tend to show you what they are if you give them enough space, and as he spoke, I noticed inconsistencies, small ones at first, a date that did not align, a clause that was too broad, language that shifted tone in a way that suggested something had been added later, and I asked quietly, may I ask who drafted this agreement, and there was a brief pause, not long, but enough to signal discomfort, and the woman replied, it was prepared by an external advisor, and I nodded slightly, I see, and I turned a page, tapping lightly on a section that had been structured to look routine, but was not, and I said, this clause here, it transfers more control than it appears to at first glance, and the room shifted, not dramatically, just enough to register that something had changed, and my father leaned forward slightly, what do you mean? And I kept my voice steady, it means the agreement was not just About short-term support, it was designed to create long-term dependency, and silence followed, not empty, but full, because once something is named correctly, it cannot be unseen, and my mother looked at the document. Then at me, and I could see the realization forming, not all at once, but in layers, and she said softly, "We did not see that," and I met her gaze calmly, not correcting, not emphasizing, just acknowledging. It was not obvious, because it was not unless you were trained to notice patterns, and I closed the folder gently and placed my hand on it, not claiming ownership, just marking a point, and I said, "We can address this, but it will require careful steps," and I glanced briefly at both of them, my parents, sitting on the same side of the table where I had once stood outside the door, and I added, "And it will require trust," letting the word settle where it needed to, because trust, unlike documents, cannot be revised once it is broken. It can only be rebuilt, slowly, deliberately, one decision at a time, and I sat back slightly, giving the room space to respond, knowing that whatever happened next would not just resolve a financial issue, it would redefine something much deeper, something that had been unsettled for a very long time. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, not because they disagreed, but because the shape of the situation had just changed, and I let that silence stay where it was, because people understand faster when they arrive at the conclusion themselves, and the man across from me adjusted his pen slightly and said, "What would you suggest as a next step?" And I noticed the shift immediately, from explanation to consultation, from control to request, and I opened the folder again, turning it toward me, not rushing, just aligning the pages the way I prefer, and I said, "First, we separate what is binding from what is assumed," and I tapped lightly on the document. "This agreement relies heavily on assumptions that were never formally acknowledged," and he leaned forward. "Are you saying it can be challenged?" And I met his question with a measured response. "I am saying it can be clarified. And clarification tends to reduce leverage when it was built on ambiguity," and the woman beside him nodded slowly, already following the direction, and I continued, "Second, we identify where the obligations exceed the original intent. Because intent matters when terms are not fully transparent," and I glanced briefly at my parents, not to involve them, but to ground the process in something they could understand, and my father asked quietly, "Does that mean we can stop this?" And I shook my head slightly, "Not stop, adjust," and adjustment is more sustainable than resistance, because resistance invites escalation, and I prefer outcomes that hold, not just outcomes that win, and I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, opening it with the same calm precision I use in every room, and I said, "If you allow me, I would like to outline a revised structure," and there was no hesitation this time, just a simple, "Please," and I began, not with conclusions, but with questions, walking them through each section, each clause, each inconsistency, not overwhelming, just guiding, and as I spoke, the dynamic in the room shifted again, more noticeably now, not toward tension, but toward alignment, because once a problem is understood clearly, people tend to move in the same direction, and about halfway through, the man who had been leading the meeting leaned back slightly and said, "You see this very differently," and I smiled faintly. "I see what is already there, because I have never believed in creating solutions that do not exist, only in revealing the ones that have been overlooked," and my mother watched quietly, not interrupting, not questioning, just observing, and I could feel her attention in a way I had not before, not distracted, not filtered, just present, and when I finished outlining the approach, I closed my laptop gently and said, "This will require coordination, and it will require time, but it is manageable," and the room remained still for a moment, then the woman nodded, "This is very helpful," and I inclined my head slightly, "I am glad," keeping the tone even, because acknowledgement does not need to be amplified to be real, and then my father spoke again, more firmly this time. "We will proceed with this," and I glanced at him, not surprised, but aware of what that sentence represented, a decision made with understanding instead of assumption, and I said, "Then we will take it step by step," and I gathered the documents, organizing them into a structure that made sense, handing each person what they needed, not more, not less, because clarity is a form of respect, and as the meeting began to settle into action, I noticed something subtle but important. No one was speaking over anyone else, no one was rushing to conclude, the room had slowed down, not in pace, but in intention, and I stood when it was appropriate, closing my bag, and my mother looked at me, not urgently, not uncertainly, just steadily, and she said, "Thank you," and I met her gaze, calm, composed, and replied, "You are welcome, Mom," and for a moment, that was enough, not a resolution, not a reconciliation, but a shift, quiet, precise, and unmistakable, the kind of shift that does not need to be announced because everyone in the room has already felt it. We did not solve everything that day, not completely, but we changed the direction, and sometimes direction matters more than speed, and over the next few weeks, I stayed involved, not as a favor, but as a responsibility I had chosen, reviewing documents late into the evening, coordinating with people who now addressed me directly instead of through intermediaries, and each step moved things forward, not dramatically, just steadily, the way real solutions tend to work, and my parents followed the structure carefully, not questioning, not resisting, just learning, and I noticed that too, the way my mother listened now, not to respond, but to understand, the way my father asked fewer questions but more precise ones, and one afternoon, after a call that confirmed the final adjustments had been accepted, the pressure eased, not all at once, but enough to be felt, and my father exhaled slowly and said, "So we are all right," and I nodded, "Yes, you are stable now," choosing the word intentionally, because stability is something you maintain, not something you assume, and my mother looked at the table for a moment before speaking, her hands resting lightly on the edge, and she said, "We would not have managed this without you," and I met her voice with the same calm I had carried from the beginning. "You could have, it just would have taken longer, because I have never believed in taking more credit than is necessary," and she shook her head slightly, not disagreeing with me, but correcting something deeper. "No, Tige, we would not have," and there was a quiet honesty in that sentence that did not need to be emphasized, and for a moment, none of us spoke, not because there was nothing left, but because what remained did not belong to the problem we had just solved, it belonged to something older, something that had been waiting, and my mother finally looked at me, directly this time, not measuring, not evaluating, just seeing, and she said, "I said something to you years ago," and I felt the sentence before she finished it, not as a memory, but as a pattern that had never fully left, and she continued, "I told you that what you wanted to do had no value," and I listened, not interrupting, because some words need to be completed to lose their weight, and she added quietly, "I was wrong," and the room stayed still, not tense, not dramatic, just honest, and I nodded once, not quickly, just enough to acknowledge what had been said, and I replied, "You made a decision based on what you understood at the time," keeping my voice steady, not to protect her, but to keep the moment clear, and she exhaled softly, "I should have understood more," and I allowed a small smile, not dismissive, just present, and I said, "Understanding takes time, because it does, and I have always believed that people deserve the chance to arrive at it, even if they take longer than you would like," and she looked at me for a moment longer and then said something simpler, something that carried more weight than anything else she had said that day, "I am proud of you," and I paused, just briefly, not because I needed the validation, but because I recognized its meaning, and I replied, "Thank you, Mom," placing the words carefully, exactly where they belonged, and we stood there for a moment, not as we had been before, not divided, not distant, just recalibrated, and as I gathered my things and prepared to leave, I glanced once at the table, the documents now organized, the problem contained, and I realized that nothing in that room had been fixed by force, it had been resolved through patience, clarity, and the quiet decision to stay composed when it would have been easier not to, and as I walked out into the afternoon light, I thought about that sentence again, the one that had followed me from the beginning, and I said it softly, not as a contradiction, but as a conclusion. Some things do not start with value, they become valuable because you refuse to abandon them, and this time I did not need anyone else to agree, because the proof had already taken its place, quietly, completely, and without asking for permission.